So there's a saying that about how certain things happen that many of you may have heard. That goes something like, something happens gradually, then suddenly, right? How did your company go bankrupt? Gradually, then suddenly. How did you become an overnight success? Gradually, then suddenly. How did you become drunk? Well, gradually and then very suddenly. How did online learning become a thing for... Is it okay if I keep going? All right. How did online learning become such a thing in K-12 education? Well, in one sense, gradually and then suddenly. And the gradually, well, the suddenly part is pretty clear, right? Pandemic, remote learning, et cetera. But the gradually part is pretty important as well, because there was a long, gradual year buildup of online, hybrid, and blended learning that had been happening since the mid to late 1990s. And so as we look at what's happened in the past year, year and a half, and more importantly, we look forward to what's going to happen in the coming school year and beyond, I think it's really important to think about how we got here, what that background was, and now we're really at this inflection point. And that's what we're going to be focused on in our remaining time this afternoon, starting with each of our panelists talking a little bit about that history and their part in that history and what they've been doing in their various organizations, and then pivoting to talk about what are the keys to success as we look forward and as we think about this issue about now that just about every student and family and teacher has experienced in the past year some version of online or remote or hybrid learning. What does that look like going forward? What does that look like in terms of ensuring that we're delivering high quality outcomes and opportunities and outcomes for students? And I'm going to start with Mickey Revenaugh. Mickey, online schooling. It's not new, right? As I said?
It's not new. It's not new. So I'm here to testify that it at least started in 2001, if not before that. That's when the company that I helped co-found, Connections Academy, got started. And so we're celebrating our 20th anniversary. We will confess that there were a couple that got in the door before us, including Florida Virtual School, which started in the late 90s, K12.com, which started a year or two before we did. But I think for all of us, and particularly for Connections, our vision was always that we were trying to build something that was potentially better than face-to-face, that it would allow students to really benefit from the personalization that technology could bring, and that we recognized early on that it would be a fairly niche audience that would be looking for the ability to go to school fully online. But as we like to joke, you know, it's not for everybody, but for the kids that it is for, it's the only thing that'll work. And so we started with a couple hundred kids in school year 2002, 2003. This past school year, we ended up at about 106,000 students. Full-time virtual school, mostly 99.9% virtual public schools, and then one global virtual private school as well. And so it's been really interesting to compare and contrast, sort of like what the emergency remote experience has been for the entire world's population that had a sampling opportunity for online learning this past year, and what we had tried to build over these past 20 years as a very intentionally structured online program that took advantage of technology and tried to do even better by kids than the best face-to-face schools.
And we should put a pin in that concept about the differences between emergency remote learning and the type of online learning that Connections are doing and the hybrid learning that others were doing. It's a great topic that I think we'll have the opportunity to get back to. And by the way, so you mentioned Connections this year having about 106,000 enrolled students. Pre-pandemic, we at Evergreen have been counting these numbers for a while. Pre-pandemic, something on the order of maybe 500,000 students in the country, so about 1% that were in these fully online schools, and that's really changed recently. We'll talk about that as well. Before I do that though, I want to go to Heather. You started an online school in Colorado. Recognize that actually a lot of students maybe want a mix of online and some face-to-face. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So very, very candidly, our district was a response, my school and the district was a response to the success of some of the schools like Mickey's. They were very angry about the students they were losing, primarily around the PPOR that was attached to them. And then we also had some darling schools, frankly, that would rather count transfers than dropouts. And so that was where the online school came from at the very beginning. So I was able to open a school, said, bring it, give me all the kids, and then realized that a lot of those kids needed some kind of interaction, face-to-face, some kind of community that was local, but really did flourish under online learning. And so by year 2, I had the opportunity to be able to open the hybrid school, and that was in 2009. I think, yes, 2009. We opened as a fully hybrid school, public school in the district. And all of those kids that were about to drop out, within 5 years, we had the highest academic growth scores in the state. And that was for my elementary school, my middle school, and my high school in literacy and math. So then we got a lot of attention, and the hybrid learning was taking off. And of course, I was following work by Mickey and the online schools, but then also as the district. So we really had a lot of freedom to blend at the time. But I saw my job as the school administrator. There's how many of you are teachers or come from districts? Teachers, superintendents? Okay, my people, I love it. So there's that old book, if you don't feed the teachers, they'll eat the students. You remember that one? So I saw my job as feeding the teachers. And one of the things that was really missing at the time for both online and for hybrid teachers was professional development, because at the time, all professional development was wrapped into the curriculum adoption. So if you bought this literacy program, the PD was for that literacy program, but there was nothing around pedagogy or strategies for kids who could be in front of you or at home or a little bit of both. And so that was kind of where a lot of my work went in as an administrator. And then I founded a nonprofit called Teach United 5 years ago, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, primarily around that professional development in all those different places.
And just to be really clear, when you hear about hybrid learning in the last year or so, in so many cases, it has referred to room and Zoom. Teacher in a room, a bunch of kids in the room, bunch of kids online as well. Hybrid in a place like Poudre Global Academy was really quite different, and in all these hybrid schools pre-pandemic in a lot of ways, and we'll touch on that as well, but really the key being the dedicated time online and dedicated time face-to-face, and the different things that you were doing in both those places. Fascinating school. I've had the pleasure of visiting a couple of times. We'll get back to that. All right, so David, we've heard from Mickey and the connections and the charter schools and Heather's school, school within a district. You've been thinking about these issues across your district, and again, pre-pandemic, but a lot happened during the last year as well. Can you talk a little bit about your district?
First, got to acknowledge the Cajon Valley people in the room. But quick side story before that. In 2004, I was a brand new principal, and a visionary superintendent in Fullerton said, David, we're going to give a laptop to every child. And my school was the only one that had enough money. We were 100% Title I, 100% EL. And I asked our teacher, should we do this? And there were these big multicolored clamshell, I don't think they were MacBooks yet. I don't know what they were. But they had a big apple on it. You remember those? Those big clamshells that did nothing.
Kind, you mean.
Right, so there was no Wi-Fi, but they had GarageBand, Keynote, iMovie, and these apps. And so there's one school across town, a fluent community, and my school. We started together. My kids far outperformed those kids. They were making podcasts and iMovies and presentations because they weren't afraid to break it or do anything wrong. And they were all starting at the same skill set. No one had the digital skill set yet. But taking that 20 years later to Cajon Valley, in 2014, we started a blended learning academy. And a lot of these people here were the initial teachers to start opening these machines. And we invited kids to learn during summer school in a no-risk environment. And we just explored. But the question was, how can we utilize technology not only just to create more authentic learning experiences, but to use data, machine learning, and science to personalize learning, to give more human time back to the child in small groups and one-on-one. So we like the phrase in Cajon Valley, less tech, more human, utilizing the best technology.
And that is something that we've heard from folks like you who have been thinking about this for a long time, the way that it's a bit of a paradox, because when people who don't understand the field very well still say things like it's about putting kids in front of computers, right? And people like you know that actually what it's doing is it's freeing up time so that kids are getting more personal interaction with their teachers and oftentimes with each other as well. So, and we'll come back to that too. But before we do that, Carlos, so super interesting. Big picture learning is something that I had known about, but not known really well, to be honest, before we started planning this panel. And I got on your website and I thought, BPL is doing all these things that we think about, these hybrid schools that are using tech in interesting ways, doing around personalization, small group instruction, all those things. But you come at it not from that technology, originally not from that technology standpoint at all. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I'll share just openly that when I was first invited to speak on this particular topic, I was really excited because the title was like Back to School, but you choose how, right? So for us, that's a big part of our design and our culture is around student voice and choice. And then even the next part of the title of the session was the case for ongoing optionality, right? I was just like, let's get it, let's do this. And then I got into the descriptor a little bit more, and it felt like it was, there was this heavy emphasis on being online more. And I was just like, all right, let's chop it up a little bit. So I'll just start off by saying that, I think historically we have just been fairly agnostic in terms of what the platform is, right? As long as it's culturally sensitive and accurate, historically like welcoming and embracing of a variety of folks. It's flexible, right? And it can be fun, right? So, but our work has been really focused on designing and redesigning and really powerful school spaces for folks. And we work with schools and systems of schools in a variety of ways. But I'll mention two specifically. Firstly is ensuring that schools are spaces that welcome and see the students and all their assets and everything that they bring into the space, right? Like we're not diving into figuring out what students can't do first, right? And we're welcoming their communities, their families, and engaging with them, right? And letting them know that they're part of the design and the experience from the beginning. And then secondly is ensuring that young people have an opportunity to learn in the real world, right? So, and that starts as early as elementary school, right? And that ranges from learning expeditions to shadow days to formal internships to even, that's my time already? To even, I'll start calling people out, I'll do that. To shadow days to even apprenticeships, right? So something we've learned over the last 18 months is first, this focus on on relationships has allowed us to, sadly, when so many schools and systems have not been able to stay connected with their young people and their families, to be able to do so in really powerful and beautiful ways. And not just assessing what the students need to do or can do or should be doing academically, but being able to serve a function that we believe that is the role of schools, is to support them in their basic human needs when everything else fails, and connecting them to sources and resources in their community and doing that. So really proud of our schools and our network and our staff that have been able to do that. The second part is this notion of like internships and learning, right? And since that's such a core function of our schools, it's like, how do you have internships and learning outside in the real world in the middle of a pandemic? And interestingly enough, young people were learning in the real world. Now, maybe they weren't going into real spaces with hundreds of people, but they were doing so really safely, in really important ways, in places that, quite honestly, they had, in most of our schools and most of our students had already established relationships with some of their internships prior to the pandemic. So there was this investment, right? This connection with other adults. And the last piece I'll share on this is why that's also for us so equally important, is that we know that there's a huge subset of young people that during the pandemic, because they were they had different financial means or resources, or their families did, they were able to flex and connect and have really rich experiences, while young people of color and young people only living in poverty did not. Right? So this piece around, and this emphasis around helping young people and those that have been historically kept from those type of opportunities develop their own social capital and their social networks is just something that for us is just at the core and part of our equity imperative. So there you go, John.
Thank you. There's like 35 different ways I could take that because you raised so many great points. You all have. I actually want to talk. I want to dig into this optionality a little bit, and I realize this isn't quite where I drafted this up, but I know that's not going to be an issue for you four, because I want to drive into this a bit because you've all created situations, schools, district, charter schools, et cetera, where students, families were choosing different options, and now what we're seeing. If I hesitate to say maybe something's good is going to come out of a pandemic that's killed hundreds of thousands of people. But if there's something that's education related, it may be the idea that more and more parents and students are asking for different options, and it's what we're seeing. And I wonder if some or all of you could just comment on how you're seeing the feedback that you're seeing from students and families in your own schools, your own districts. And secondly, a little bit about maybe how you see some of that scaling. Because one of the things that I love about this panel is it's one thing to do this in a small school, maybe a single school, but you've all done it at some scale. And Heather, I'm thinking also about Teach United that you should touch on at some point. So I'm going to open this to anybody who would like to comment about either of those two things.
I want to start where Carlos left off in equity, because we found early in the pandemic, because we were one-to-one, because our kids had ubiquitous access to Wi-Fi, when we had to go and do some distance learning in the beginning, it was an easy transition. Yeah. Kids know how to log on, single sign-on, they were able to get into their computers. That wasn't an issue for us, but once we realized that this is going to go on for a little bit, then our affluent families started to find options. We'll make a pod, I'll hire a teacher, we'll invite this family, and then there was my ice skating rink where I play ice hockey, had ice hockey camp. Kids could come be dropped off at the ice rink. The ice instructors did tutoring. They did their distance learning. They had ice time for $1,000 a week. Amazing for those kids. But then we found that the 70% of our low-income families, they didn't have options. We talk about optionality. So we went to our labor associations and said, our families are suffering. They're saying that they can't go to work, that they can't put food on the table. It's a choice. Either I stay home and do distance learning, or I go to work. It's not both and. And so we, as a group, as a community, said we're going to open our schools. This was back in April of 2020 because our children and families were suffering. And we did. Slowly, we opened for free childcare for essential workers. Then by summer of 2020, we opened all of our schools. And our principals led our teachers back to school to open all schools for all students. And then when we started in the opening of the school year, the California Teachers Association came in and said, you better stop what you're doing. We're going to keep the entire state closed. The statewide organization said, you know, we're not going to allow school districts to be unsafe, even though we had no in-school transmission. And so we went to our board, and I said, the California Teachers Association said that they're going to march with caskets. They're going to bring tombstones and say, I can't teach if I'm dead. And they're going to line the streets with union protesters. They're not even going to be our employees. Our teachers want to work. And I told our school board, I don't think they're bluffing. I actually think they're going to do this. But then we went to CTA and said, we're not advocating for the 30% that have options. If you talk about equity, social justice, it's our children of color and low income that don't have options. We're opening for them. And if you stand in our way, shame on you.
And I think
so what happened?
What happened?
And we applied for a waiver, we opened, and it was quiet, and we went back to work, serving the community.
Right.
Mickey.
Well, what I was going to say is it's just such a telling example of how I think the optionality of families and kids gets so overlooked in the pawn game that's played by the powers that be, whether those are politicians, state superintendents saying there will be no remote learning, everybody's back face to face, or the opposite. You know, it's like no one can come in. It all has to be online because none of those things have anything to do with what it is that kids and families need and want. It has to do instead with the power play around, you know, how we manage the pandemic otherwise. And so when you get down onto a sort of family by family, student by student basis, people take advantage of and put together the optionalities that make sense for them. And you know, in our online schools where we had this huge influx of people who had never done this before, ever, they came to our schools really because they were looking for something more structured and richer than what was happening in most school districts around the country. And they discovered, whoa, my kids can play chess with kids from all over the country. Isn't that cool? I want to do that. There's a field trip that we could organize within our state with other families who are in the school. I want to do that. And so facilitating and helping support what it is that families and kids wanted to do within this incredibly flexible structure of online learning, we learned a tremendous amount about how many commonalities there are in what families and kids really want from their schools, and how different kind of schools can meet those things without being doctrinaire about it has to be this. The whole binary, it either has to be this or that, is really making me pretty crazy. And I'm thrilled to hear that a large school district has found a way to get past that.
One of the things I'm really concerned about after seeing last year and what's coming up is, I'm hearing you say that you've reopened the schools because that's what your kids and families needed. But I saw a lot of other schools opening because they passed out all the laptops and the kids didn't log in, so we're going to reopen. And so it wasn't actually a choice based, it wasn't actually an option based on what the kids or families needed because the hardware didn't fix it, so let's go back to what we were doing before. And I'm seeing nods, little amen in the corner. So the districts that I'm really concerned about right now are the ones that have said we're going back, but it's because they're not innovative, because they don't have relationships otherwise. Because a relationship can carry through Zoom, it can carry in person. But there are a lot of districts right now that are saying we're going to go back and we're not having an online option. It didn't work. Kind of the, online by emergency didn't work, so we're not doing it. And if you follow the UK, we had a speaker, I think it was yesterday, was talking about the numbers in the UK and those kids and how quickly the quarantines are happening. And now you've got tens of thousands of kids that are back home online, and there was zero plan for it. And it's because all of the solutions last year for the districts that weren't already thinking ahead, all of the solutions revolved around the hardware. So it was either, how quickly can we get laptops out? Hey, Alan, see a big nod back there, National Rural Education Association back there. So it was all about broadband and it was all about laptops. But it wasn't about instruction. It wasn't about connections. It wasn't about relationships. And there is a frightening amount of districts that are going into this school year with that same mindset. Everybody in this room knows technology is an accelerator, but if what you have in terms of relationships and instruction is garbage, that's what you're accelerating.
I love that. I just need to say that. A few things that I think that definitely surfaced over the last 18 months, right? So there was this focus on obviously ensuring that all young people, or as many as very, very much possible, had access to technology, right, and broadband, right? So it wasn't just a challenge of schools, right? It was like communities were coming together, corporations were coming together to ensure that happened. So there was just great energy that was put before that. So that's enlightening and that's energetic, and want to continue to carry that through what is probably going to be an additional period where the school year is going to be interrupted. This abandonment of seat time, right, which was also a very interesting one, right? This commitment to butts in seats, and that's the only way that you learn. Guess what? That's not necessarily the case, and we learned a lot about that over the last 18 months. And then the last one that a lot of states started kind of rethinking and reevaluating the weight and the importance of standardized tests, right, in this moment, right, where we have a number of states that were very heavy on high-stakes tests, that you had to absolutely pass these to graduate high school, who said, you know what, these are actually not as important right now, right? So if they're not as important right now, are they about to be important again?
You talk about states and some districts perhaps learning that kids didn't need to be in seats to be successful, and I think that's absolutely true. I'm also worried about the converse of that. I'm worried about the number of people, the number of, especially politicians and policymakers, whose lesson appears to have been, online learning didn't work. Now let's get those butts back in seats, and that's a concern. And so I want to make sure that with our last 15 minutes or so here, we pivot to this issue of how do we help schools and districts think about being successful, because in creating different options, whether it's online, whether it's hybrid, whether it's in school, I'd love from each of you to hear one key element of success. I know there's a bunch, but let's just have each of you pick one, run with it, talk about why it's important and what it looks like in some different environments that you've worked in.
All right.
Go ahead, David.
I'll start where Heather was talking about the districts that, went to digital because they had to. It was like, it wasn't gradually then suddenly, it was just suddenly, right? And I think because they didn't have the opportunity to learn about the digital tools, how to use data to progress monitor, they didn't have the infrastructure of software like Beable and iReady and the things that we have had already, that it was hard. It was a hard lift because they didn't know how to use the data or use the tools. But what we have with competency-based learning and tools that help teachers with progress monitoring, kids can then be anywhere and demonstrate their learning. And one of the architects for Camp Cajon, Janelle back there, we ran a 6-week summer school called Camp Cajon, best summer ever. The kids learned to surf, to paddleboard, to snorkel. They put on Beauty and the Beast. They had competitive sports leagues. And the parents asked for this. They said, we said, what do you want? They said, we want our kids to do all these different things. So our teachers and principals created it. We let the kids choose based on interest what their summer experience would be. And then we wrapped around the literacy and mathematics around that experience. Levels of engagement went way up. And so I think what we learned is that maybe school should look more like Camp Cajon. We should create interest-based opportunities and utilize the digital tools and technology to make sure that we are monitoring their progress and keeping them on that track.
And I think what will come of that, I hope, is a cohort of parents who are now super energized around what school could be. Because the one thing that a lot of families got a firsthand look at that they'd never seen before is how frickin' boring school is on a normal basis. It's like, kind of blew the doors and windows off the school building, as a superintendent in Baltimore said, and you got a front row seat to how much tedium there is baked into the traditional school day and how poorly sometimes the teachers treat your kids in terms of trying to behavior manage. And it's a horrible experience. And most adults would go, I wouldn't spend all day doing that if I could help it. And so the energy around, it could be like Camp Cajon instead. It could be personalized. It could be at your own pace. It could be full of warm, personalized relationships with adults that aren't just you. Once you get a taste of that, it's really pretty hard to let it go. And I think that parents, even parents who aren't in affluent school districts and aren't privileged, now have a language to talk about some of the things that they really liked coming out of this experience. And I'm not sure that they're going to stand for going back to normal if normal included some of the things that was revealed to them over this last 18 months.
There was that survey, I think it's the National Parents Union, that when they put the question to parents, do you want to go back to normal or what was before, or do you want to see something different? The overwhelming numbers were, we want to see something different. I want to build on what you just said, Mickey. I want to go to Heather to talk about teachers. And then, Carlos, I want to go to you to talk about, BPL talks about the role of advisors and other elements in student support, which I think both of these things are so critical, and a lot of times they get conflated because it's kind of seemed like the role, the way you do student support is through the teacher. BPL does more than that. A lot of hybrid schools do. Before we get to that though, teachers. Heather, you've been thinking about them a lot.
That's what I do. So when Teach United works with districts and when we're coaching with schools, we really try to dive pretty heavily into the evidence and into kind of the data on student outcomes. And I feel like one of the mistakes a lot of districts made is they base a lot of decisions on anecdotes. It used to be kind of, the initiative du jour. But, it's really a lot about anecdotes. It's about something that's personal that legislator likes that year rather than the evidence. And so if you look at, I'm a big fan of John Hattie's work in the visible learning and, in the meta-analysis of the 80,000 studies from around the world that actually puts an effect size on different strategies that teachers can use. And so when we work with districts, one of the things that we look at, we don't look at their tech plan first. We don't look at, their platform or anything. We look at collective teacher efficacy. We look at students being able to self-report on their data. Those have the biggest effect effect sizes on student growth, up to 2 to 3 years academic growth. It says nothing about whether that's happening in person or online or hybrid. The delivery and the format, the location of the butt in the seat doesn't matter. What matters is, first and foremost, is the collective teacher efficacy, whether or not those teachers believe they can make a difference, whether they feel like they're prepared to make a difference and supported to make a difference. So all of these districts that are saying like, oh, online learning was the worst thing that's ever happened to us, and they're back there in 3 weeks, guess what they just did to their collective teacher efficacy? They just told their teachers that what you're forced to do now is the worst thing ever, and you have no choice. And so I think that's the main thing that we look at when we're working with teachers, is what has the evidence to actually move the needle for kids, both positive and negative, because the top negative factors are things like boredom, we just talked about that, retention, summer school, being disliked. Some of that kind of stuff happens more in person than it does online. So you actually took away a big negative factor for kids when they were online in some cases. So I think that's the biggest part of the conversation, is really just making sure that whatever decision is being made at the highest level, whether it's legislation or whether it's superintendent or in the classroom or with parents, really share those effect sizes on what will this strategy do for your students' outcomes. Carlos?
So I'll say something just as a former teacher and principal. I've wholeheartedly believe that educators and teachers get into the profession primarily because they love working with young people, beyond their content, right? It's just I love working with young people, I want to do that. And somewhere along the lines, right, depending on where you end up, your content becomes actually more important than that, right? And that's what I think what ended up happening, what we saw a glimpse of is, at least at the onset of this pandemic, was an emphasis on going back to that humanistic connection that the teachers and adults in schools can have with young people. I think that's really important. The role of the advisor, in the big picture schools, right? So many, I think at this point, all high schools, right, have a homeroom, right? And in many cases, they've converted them into there's an advisory system that in some cases can look like a glorified homeroom, but it's still a homeroom, right, for attendance taking and other purposes. Think that the opportunity right now that we have is to rethink in addition to obviously delivery of content and facilitation of learning, is this emphasis on relationship building, but in the long term, right? Not the snapshot, I have you for a year, I have you for a semester, but I'm gonna be with you for your 4 years or your 3 years if you're in middle school grades. And I'm here to support you to the finish line, right? I'll also have some content that I need to deliver, right? And facilitate some learning amongst that. But my job is to support you, stay connected to you, and see you through to the end. I mean, for us, that's at the essence of the advisory structure, right? It's just I'm going to support you and do everything I can. Figure out what are those resources, stay connected to your family, figure out what it is that you love to do, what are those things that you perhaps aren't very good at, but you know you need to improve on, and figure out how we do that and leverage your strengths and assets, and this notion of continuing to learn how to learn. So.
And we've kind of created a role in some of our online schools, especially our international ones, called a success coach. That's their job, right? It's not a different kind of school counselor. It really is a different role that's about the student's ultimate success. However, that's defined by them and the person that they're working with. And it's amazing what a difference that makes. And it's there's absolutely no reason that shouldn't be part of every student's life, face-to-face, online, blended, whatever it might be. Having an advocate like that make a huge difference.
And I think the interesting thing about the way Connections is doing this, BPL is doing this, and I know there's some other districts doing this as well, is the systematizing of the role that you're talking about, right? Because when you talk about the idea of, hey, there's somebody in that school who knows that student's trajectory, knows that student not just academically, but the personal aspects of what that student is going through. Teachers will often play that role. But if you're not systematizing that in some way, then you're going to have kids falling through the cracks. And that's not to say a kid never falls through the cracks in any of your schools, but it creates the opportunity and the ideal that if this student's having a problem for mental health reasons, social reasons, physical health reasons, family reasons, there's somebody who knows that, who understands that, and is thinking about that. And the other thing this also raises in my mind is the idea that we talked about personalization. David, you were talking about personalization. There's a number of ways to think about personalization, right? And I'd love to go back to you on this, David, because I think if you wander the halls, especially the exhibit hall of a conference like this, when you hear personalization, what that means to still too many people is we know exactly that student can multiply 3-digit numbers but not 2-digit numbers, right? And that's a legitimate aspect of personalization, but there's so many others, whether it's the internships, the advising, the career stuff. David?
Well, yeah, so a lot of folks think that personalized learning is differentiated instruction with technology.
Yeah.
That's not the case. The root word of personalization is person. Who is the child? Every child is unique and special. I'm channeling Ed.D, our Chief Innovation Officer over there. And our vision in choral response, please, everybody who knows it, is happy kids engaged in on a path to gainful employment. So
It's not a culture anymore.
But if we think about that, happy kids, self-awareness, self-esteem, self-efficacy belief, healthy relationships with the help of an advisor to build connections with their peers, but also the adults in the building and the community. The gainful employment is the hard one, and ET from Federal Student Aid has helped with that last part in terms of how do you ensure every child gets to gainful employment and financial freedom. That should be one of the outcomes we aim at, and it's through career development, it's through financial empowerment, it's through social emotional learning, and we've systematized that with Beable, our technology partner, through the world of work. And that's how we reach every kid every day towards that vision.
And to get back to the options idea and to where I think the online element comes in is when you bring in some of those different options, you free up the ability for a student to be out of school in an internship, working a job, pursuing dance, theater, sports, et cetera. And so they're getting engaged, because that's the other thing I see. I see when you talk about student engagement, so often it's like, hey, look at this great content we've got, and it's so engaging. It's like, sorry folks, I have yet to see a student who's super engaged by any form of online content. What they're engaged by is the idea that, hey, I'm interested in this field, this topic, I'm working in it, I'm studying it, and that's what gets them jazzed about going to school. All right, we are down to 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I want to give you each a chance to leave the audience with something. You've each got about 40 seconds, and I'll go this way, starting with Carlos.
I believe that, yeah. Well, first, I appreciate Heather, David, Mickey, thank you for the conversation. I think just given the last 18 months, we're in an unprecedented moment where there's so much that we can just continue to learn from what we all just went through. And recognizing that we're going to probably continue to have to pivot as schools and as systems moving forward. But there are tons of glimmers of hope and success that we can continue to draw from. So looking forward to it.
So I've been thinking a lot about sort of the intimacy of the Zoom call and how I think prior to the pandemic, none of us would have said you could get to know your coworkers, your colleagues, your students that well if you weren't face-to-face with them. And I think that what we saw was actually kind of the opposite was true, that from knowing each person sort of on an equal basis, taking up the same amount of space on a screen with their name attached to it, with what you can see about their background, that actually our ability to be intimately connected with each other in a way that's very real is accelerated by that kind of technology. And so I think I would love to see us take advantage of technology even in face-to-face settings that takes away the barriers that we put between ourselves and our kids and allows us to connect in a way that's really vibrant. And that, frankly, is the air they breathe anyway, right? The only time we ask them not to do that is when they're in school. So, so I'm kind of in favor of the video conference moving forward.
David.
Just a quote, John Adams, founding father, said, education ought to do two things, teach us how to live and how to make a living. And if the things we're doing in our schoolhouse don't align with those things, we should probably stop doing them.
Excellent. Heather, last word.
I gotta follow
16
John
seconds.
Adams. So I would say that the main thing that I look at is that hybrid learning is post-secondary readiness. I work online. I have virtual meetings, had nothing to do with the pandemic. And so I think if we just make that shift, that we're actually preparing kids for a better future by giving them the options of hybrid and online learning and letting them make global connections, it'll be a lot better. I work with organizations like All Points North Foundation and the Rural Association, and I'm able to do that because of technology. It is my career readiness, and I think that's what we should offer for kids.
Fantastic. Folks, I've been given one final charge, which is to get everybody out of this room really fast because they have a quick turnaround. So 2 things. First of all, the panelists will slowly make their way out if you have questions for them. And secondly, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks, John.